lot of times you'll hear people ask why so much of our food contains corn or soy or wheat. And the reason, at least in part, is we're really good at efficiently growing, storing, and processing those crops. And to try to expand and diversify human diets beyond commodity crops can come at a price.
I mean, there's incredible diversity of chemistry that's made in plants. There's so many amazing, flavors and aromas and ingredients out there, but it's really common that these plants that make some of our favorite flavors either produce just tiny amounts or the plant itself is hard to grow.
That's Dr. Matt DiLeo at Elo Life Systems. Rather than trying to turn plants that are hard to grow like monk fruit or vanilla into commodity crops, they're using science to produce the molecule we want from the plants we already know how to grow at scale.
And if we can take the genetic programming out of those plants and put them in easy to grow commodity plants, then you can produce those same great, exactly the same molecule, bioidentical ingredient in a manner that's much more scalable and much less expensive.
And if we can produce these ingredients more efficiently, we can make processed food healthier.
Most of the space in the grocery store that we all go out and fill our shopping carts with each week is food that comes in jars and boxes and bags. There's a lot that we eat that comes from that part of the grocery store, and we can make it taste better and be healthier.
Dr. Matt DiLeo on today's Future of Agriculture podcast. Hello, fellow Ag Nerd. Thank you so much for joining me for another episode of the Future of Agriculture. My name is Tim Hamrich, and if you're interested in where innovative ideas meet practical realities in food production, I think you found the right show. Super excited today to bring onto the show Matt DiLeo of Elo Life Systems. Some of you might remember that Elo Life CEO Todd Rands was a part of episode 412 of this podcast, Biologicals is Not a Category. That was about 2 years ago now, and I have been fascinated with their work ever since. They're bringing to the market what they call molecular farming. And to some of you, that might be a new term. I know it was for me a couple years ago. Matt does a great job of explaining this concept and how this shifts some of the value from just producing commodity crops and then trying to use them in food processing to add a bunch of value, but instead creating that value on the farm with genetics, where we can produce highly desirable, healthy ingredients, or at least the molecules for those inside of commodity crops that farmers already grow. It's kind of a mind-blowing concept, but one that's pretty exciting, I think. Some background here on Matt. Dr. Matt DiLeo serves as the Vice President of Research and Development at Elo Life Systems. In his role, Matt applies agricultural omics and precision breeding technologies to advance Elo's product pipeline. Prior to joining Elo, Matt held scientific leadership roles at Novozymes and KeyGene USA. He received his Ph.D. in Plant Pathology from UC Davis, my alma mater, and completed a postdoc at the Boyce Thompson Institute, where he studied the impact of silencing regulatory genes on the nutritional composition of the tomato fruit metabolome. All right, well, that's very technical, but as you're going to hear, he really, really knows his stuff. He knows the science, and he has been on the cutting edge of ag science and technology several times throughout his career, and I think it's pretty cool to hear how that's all played out and how it's all come together into the work he's doing today. So I'll drop you into the conversation here where Matt is explaining how he got into this type of work.
I grew up in the burbs. My family's not in agriculture. I come from city folk. And for me, I love the complexity of the natural world. And I love science in college. And I kind of had two paths in front of me. One was to kind of double down on the kind of immunology, ultimately would have been a pharma path. And one was it was actually a professor in my college who pointed out that this field of plant pathology existed. And I always loved gardening. I always loved being outside. And it seemed like a really great opportunity to combine kind of the picky ecology and molecular biology with kind of the natural world and plants and growing plants, which I'd always found myself gravitating towards. And as I kind of immersed myself in the field and study, I loved the ability to really have application out in the world where you could use all this theory that you were developing to actually make better crops and better food, and just something that we all benefit from.
Great. Well, this will be my first time out here because I'm doubting myself in my head. Is it pronounced Elo Life or Elo Life?
It is Elo.
Okay.
Hello.
Okay. I think I've probably said it both ways is how I'm feeling right now. But so prior to Elo Life, you said you were kind of on this search to apply this knowledge and interest and kind of technical expertise. What areas did you find, before Elo Life, which we'll talk about for majority of the interview today, what areas did you find and kind of how would you characterize your career before that?
Yeah, it's interesting. In a technical field like mine, you kind of hit these touchstones over and over again. And when I finished up my grad degree, I knew I wanted to do something applied. I remember sitting in a presentation where a professor was talking about this one protein they were spending their whole career studying, and it really hit me like I can't study one protein my whole career. So, plant pathology seemed like the path to kind of get a job working in the seed industry. And I wasn't able to get one right away. And so I thought, okay, well, where can I put myself to help me have the best chance of getting into the seed industry? And at the time, that was work in the corn genetics lab. So I ended up going to Cornell to do that. And it was pretty fortuitous because there were some kind of shifts in how the funding was set up. And then I actually found myself doing like a chemistry metabolomics project where we were studying the chemistry of all these different varieties of tomatoes and peppers and other related fruit, and using what was then some new kind of data science approaches to just sort through these thousands of different chemicals and try and look for associations with the biology we were interested in. And I learned some, kind of basic programming and some statistics and data science, which was great timing because then I ended up getting a role at KeyGene where there's this very interesting, very innovative little, basically breeding technology company in the Netherlands. And they had just started a little outpost in the US where they really wanted to build up their data science capabilities. At the time, this is when sequencing really was just getting started. And so I was able to get a role there, helping them kind of invent ways that we could combine what we knew about plant biology with all these new informatic approaches to basically pick genes that would make plants, have better yield, drought tolerance, all these important traits. And, a sign of the times, at the time, we were all looking through microarray data, which was an old technology that was very kind of 90s, early 2000s. And I was there right as sequencing really kind of became common. And then from there, I ended up pivoting to a job at Novozymes, which is, again, great timing. So I remember I was at the ASTA conference one December when Novozymes and Monsanto had announced they were going to be doing this great big joint collaboration to basically find microbes that can make plants grow better, which, we've all seen blossom into this huge field. So that was right at the beginning of that. That was I think that was December of 2013 when they announced that. And so I was able to join Novozymes, and it was just an amazing opportunity where they hired basically 100 people at one time. And so as, one of the R&D managers, I helped kind of build this organization and help us kind of work with our colleagues at Monsanto to figure out how we could use microbes to make plants grow better. And, we learned a lot. I think, the lessons we were learning early on, I think have become repeated by many other folks in this field. And it's been nice to see that field mature and people kind of zero in on where the value is. And then more recently, I got an opportunity to move over to precision biosciences, which basically became the role at Elo, where the focus was on gene editing, which again was nice timing. It was kind of when gene editing was kind of just breaking the mainstream. And they were basically rebooting a kind of plant science department that they had within the company to really push and see how much value can we get with gene editing in plants. And so, I worked with the other leaders there to help build up the initial R&D team, and we got some paid projects. And then eventually in December of 2021, we were spun out to be an independent Series A startup. And at that point, we pivoted to molecular farming as the technology we were really focused on. And again, then going back to my postdoc work on plant metabolomics and data science, it really kind of came into play and was one of these touchstones where, the same technologies always come back around again.
Yeah, and what's fascinating to me is you have stayed the course in terms of science and finding valuable application for science, but you really have crossed a lot of domains that I don't talk to a lot of scientists that cross into, from plant pathology to genetics to, data science, and in the gene editing and kind of how have you been able to, because I don't imagine you have a lot of peers that have sort of blurred those, what seem to be silos.
Yeah, I think it's more common than people realize. I mean, most people who find themselves on the PhD path, it's really about learning how to learn. When you're confronted with this new technical specialty that goes so deep, to kind of quickly get an understanding of what are the right ways to ask questions, what are the key, parameters to understand. And so I see that in a fair number of scientists I work with, that they always have these kind of interesting journeys where they go into what seem like very different fields. And often you learn lessons that are broadly applicable no matter what you do.
Very cool. Well, all right. So let's get to the present day here at Elo Life. You all are doing, as you just said, molecular farming. For a lot of listeners, it's going to be a new term, although we did talk to Todd Rands from Elo Life on the show, I want to say 2 or 3 years ago. For those who are hearing that term for the first time, molecular farming, can you define it for us here?
Yeah, it's pretty simple. It's basically the idea of creating plants that make molecules that that plant doesn't normally make. So there's a lot of companies in this space right now, for example, making animal proteins in plants as having a plant kind of based source of animal protein. The way we like to think about it is a little more specific of there's so many amazing specialty crops that make all these great molecules, all these great ingredients, but these are often very difficult, very expensive to grow. And if we can take the genetic programming out of those plants and put them in easy to grow commodity plants, then you can produce those same great, exactly the same molecule, bioidentical ingredient in a manner that's much more scalable and much less expensive. And fundamentally, this is you do this either with a transgenic GM approach or with gene editing.
Yeah. So if I'm tracking here, it's kind of thinking about these commodity crops and saying, okay, these are really efficient, factories, for lack of a better term. Like, we on an acre of corn, we can produce, let's say, 250 bushels on a good acre of corn. Since we're already good at producing, let's see if we can get them to produce, a higher value molecule as a result of the crop. Is that right? And maybe if you can give us an example to help us understand that.
Yeah, that's exactly it. And, my favorite example of a difficult to grow crop is actually vanilla, which we're all very familiar with, right? I mean, there's incredible diversity of chemistry that's made in plants. There's so many amazing, flavors and aromas and ingredients out there. But it's really common that these plants that make some of our favorite flavors either produce just tiny amounts or the plant itself is hard to grow. And the reason why vanilla is a great example, we all are very familiar with it. And it's actually an orchid that grows in the rainforest. And it's not even really grown in agriculture. There's these smallholder farmers that live in places like Madagascar that basically take cuttings off of trees and put them on other trees. They hand pollinate it, they harvest the beans, and then there's this really long supply chain with all these middlemen with predictable impacts on the consistency and quality and cost. And at the end of the day, there's this amazing ingredient called pure vanilla extract that's really expensive and really variable. And when you go to the grocery store, there's almost no real vanilla in any of those products, but there's a huge amount of vanilla flavored ones. And what that is that there's a single chemical. It's one of the main chemicals in vanilla. It's called vanillin. And you can make it really cheaply now using synthetic chemistry based on either petroleum feedstocks or waste from paper pulp. And so everything in the grocery store that tastes like vanilla is pretty much this imitation vanilla molecule, as opposed to, you see the extract in the spice section where it's like $15 for, a little vial. And you see this broadly across the food system. There's all these amazing, rich, healthy, delicious molecules that are just too expensive or too variable to really be put into the food products. And we either then don't get to use those flavors or we get these kind of poor substitutes. And that's something that I think we can really address with molecular farming, because we can produce that exact same chemical in a crop, to your point, like corn, that we know how to produce at scale and we know how to produce relatively inexpensively.
It's so cool. It's so talk more about, and you can continue with a vanilla example or use a different one. What makes these substitutes that we currently have inadequate or maybe not ideal?
Yeah, so let me take a step back then and kind of tell you how we found our way to the product that we're working on. So, there's thousands of things that we could have done. There's all these different chemicals out there that food companies want to be able to use to improve the quality of their products. But we wanted to see where we could have the most impact. And so if you talk to consumers, if you talk to experts in the food company about what's important to consumers, you kind of hit these major high-level touchstones, right? People want food that's delicious. They want it to be healthy. They want it to be natural. They want to be able to feel good about what they're putting in their bodies and giving to their families. And then one of the first specific things you'll hear after that is they want to eat less sugar. We all, I think most of us know that we should be eating a lot less sugar. I mean, I'm here drinking a little can of sugar as it is. I'm no better than everyone else. And there's been estimates that it causes, approaching $1 trillion in unnecessary medical expenses every year because we're just consuming this substance that tastes great. We have this biological drive for sweetness. Culturally, in the West, we really love our sweet foods, and even when we know that they're not very good for us. And then what we learned is that there's this whole area of natural sweeteners, where there's these molecules that are made by a number of different plant species that actually they bind to the sweet receptors on your taste buds and they trigger that sweet sensation, but they don't have calories. So, when you eat these natural plant molecules, they taste sweet, but they don't have any calories. And that's when we really kind of, our ears perked up. We're like, okay, well, here's some plant-based sources of chemicals that could really solve this major consumer need, right? People want sweet things, but they don't want to have so much sugar that they're putting in their bodies. And the more that we learned about this, we realized that there's, kind of a unique opportunity to do this molecular farming. So there aren't too many natural sweeteners that are out there. The one that's probably most used and most well known is stevia, which, again, has a chemical in it. It's natural. It's from a plant. It sticks onto your taste buds and it tastes sweet. And, we all know people who specifically don't like the taste of stevia, right? It's going to kind of put some people off. It's a useful ingredient. It's useful in a lot of things, but it has real limitations. It's not robust against wide differences in temperature or pH, which lots of foods have, different temperatures and pHs. And it also has really poor solubility. So all the soda that's produced, all the carbonated soft drink, they're concentrated into these syrups for transport. And if you do that with the stevia sweetener, it all just falls out of solution and it doesn't work. But we learned about a different sweetener called monk fruit. And we learned that this is a sweetener that many people in the food industry think is one of the best tasting natural sweeteners. Consumers, to the extent that they're aware of it, are really curious about it and really like it. It has really great functionality, so you can put it in all kinds of different foods and drinks, and you don't have all those issues that happen so much with some of these other sweeteners. And here's the key thing. It's produced by a plant that's almost impossible to grow. So we have this ingredient that consumers, love to the extent they've been exposed to it. Food companies are really desperate for affordable and easy to source sources of this sweetener, but the plant itself really limits how well this can work. And it's funny, let me tell you how this plant grows. So this is a melon variety, and they grow on these cliff sides in these cloud forests in one region of China. Until recently, you couldn't even grow them on flat ground. So they like being way up in these cliffs. They have to put these expensive trellising systems in. They need shade cloth because they don't like too much sun. They have to hand pollinate every flower, and then they hand harvest the fruit, which they often have to freeze so that it doesn't go bad. And people have tried to grow this crop in South America and India. To my knowledge, it's never been able to be grown successfully anywhere else. And so you can imagine this is a very expensive crop to grow. There's not really a path for it getting less expensive. And you can also imagine coming all the way from China, there's all kinds of things that can happen to break down that supply chain. And we've heard all these stories, especially from buyers from some of the ingredient food companies, that they know their teams love monk fruit sweetener. And every once in a while, they would get a contract for, the sweetener to have a good volume of a good price. And then it would get canceled at the last minute due to some issue with production or the supply chain. So kind of putting these pieces together, we see a natural sweetener, again, it's kind of an unqualified good. If we can get people sweet things with less sugar, that's good for all of us. It's a rapidly growing market. So natural sweeteners, the total market size, I think, is approaching $1 billion. And I think it's on track to be $2 billion in 10 years. So there's a real economic opportunity there. And for our technology, it's all based on a plant that's all but impossible to grow and it's too expensive and unreliable. And so if we can produce this exact same monk fruit sweetener in something that's easy to grow, particularly a commodity in the US, we can bring the price down, we can have a supply chain that's reliable, and we can give all these food companies this amazing natural sweetener that the consumers already want.
Yeah. So so the old way would be, monk fruit, really high demand, really hard to grow. We need to do something about that. Invest decades and millions, if not more, into figuring out how to make monk fruit, a little bit more adaptable to more areas and more productive. And this is a totally different approach to say, well, what do we need the monk fruit for? And can we put that in another crop? I imagine that involves having to identify where in the genome is responsible for making that molecule and then trying to get it into another crop. That's oversimplifying, I'm sure, but walk us through that part of things.
Yeah, that's exactly right, Tim. And people have spent huge amounts of resources to try and grow monk fruit better. And, we're just not, we're not there. So you're exactly right. So every plant, is made up of genes, and each gene has a job. And when it comes to some of these molecules that plants make, you'll need a whole pathway. It's like a whole assembly line of these little enzymes that pass one chemical to the next one to make these complex chemicals. And so what we had to do was identify, it's basically a 15 gene pathway in these monk fruit plants that make these sweeteners. And then we had to take that whole 15 gene pathway and put it into other plants. And so as you can imagine, there's a big discovery process of trying to understand what are all the genes that we need. Often there's different versions of each gene. There's way you can kind of turn them up or turn them down. And so there's a lot of optimization. And, it's made more challenging because the chemical that's in monk fruit that tastes sweet, it's a class of chemicals called magricides. And there's one in particular called Mogricide 5. That's the main sweet chemical that's in monk fruit. But there's 33 or more other versions of this that are all slightly different structures. Some are sweet, some are bitter, some have strong taste or weak taste. You're not only just making that one chemical, but there's a whole family that you have to kind of balance, because in the end, you want to have a good composition of chemicals so it has this excellent sweet taste, and you also need really high levels. And as you can imagine, when we start dropping that programming in different types of plants, we'll get different outputs. So there's lots of optimization to understand which genes, which combinations of genes, which plants it works well in to really create something that's going to be a fantastic product.
And is that the part where the gene editing might come in? You know, the gene editing process to try to tune those genes to your liking.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. For this project, it's really a transgenic approach because we're moving genes from monk fruit into other crops. Though there's other situations with simpler chemicals that you could use gene editing as well. You know, most commercial transgenic plants have 1 or 2 genes in them, and we're moving, a dozen or more. So it's a different kind of scale of engineering that we're doing that makes sense with the transgenic approach.
Huh. And I think when I spoke to Todd, he was talking about watermelons, that it would be like monk fruit sweetener molecules produced in watermelon crops. I don't know if there's other crops as well, but I never got a chance to ask him, and I'm finally getting a chance to ask you. How do you know that you can extract that on the other end? Like, you could put the molecule in watermelon, but how do you get it back, I guess? Or is that something that the food scientists need to worry about?
No, that's critical. That's something we think about on day one. So, if you were doing something like this with precision fermentation, right? No one wants to drink the fermentation broth. So it's the same thing with plants. We have to think about what is this plant material that we're going to be extracting this chemical from, and make sure that it kind of makes sense from an ingredient space. So if we're expressing it in a juice, you can crush that and that can be a juice product. There's other crops that are, if you think of, in our case, it's sugar beet we're actually focused on, where it's kind of a factory process crop. We're already used to purifying out individual molecules. And if we're trying to produce a purified natural sweetener powder, which is the format that most food companies use these sweeteners in, then that's kind of an ideal crop for us. And so for us, you kind of think of it as a 3 main ways that we would pick these crops. One is which crops can technically produce large amount of the best version of the sweetener. The second are which crops are kind of easy to grow commodities that make sense and kind of have the right kind of supply chain to make this an affordable product. And the third is what you just said, is what is the material that we're actually extracting this sweetener from, and does it make sense in the format of the food applications that we'll use?
Yeah. And this is more maybe a general theoretical question, but if we are growing a crop because we want this molecule, are you still able to use the crop for other purposes as well? Or is this displacing, like if it were watermelons, it's displacing watermelons so that these watermelons are only for monk fruit molecule production? I don't know the right term there, versus like where the watermelons would have been going before molecular farming.
Yeah, that is such an important question. And so that's basically the world of co-products, which make all of this work much better. So the 2 main product concepts that we were focused on was watermelon, as you said, where we're basically trying to produce 100% juice that has this natural sweetener. So you could make, 100% juice blends that had lower calories, right? Because, when I was a kid, all the kids drank juice. Now there's so much sugar in it that parents are, afraid to give their kids juice. But this would be a way of having a natural 100% juice with lower sugar. The other way is sugar beet. And we're actually focused on this most right now. And this is just like corn or soybean, sugar beets go to a factory and all the different molecules are pulled apart. And so in a sugar beet processing factory, they basically chop these sugar beets up into pieces, kind of like French fries, put them in hot water. All the sugar is pulled out into the solution, and they go through all these purification steps to produce just pure white crystal sugar. And then at the end of that, you have molasses. So molasses has some residual sugar, some other plant chemicals in there. And these factories already actually extract other valuable molecules from that molasses, like betaine, using this sophisticated chemistry equipment. And so that's where our Mogricides will be present as well. To put it overly simply, one last skid in the factory that just extracts your molecule, and you're not paying for production of the crop, shipping it to the processor, all the processing. You're basically just paying for this one final step, and then value share with your partners. And when you have a co-products approach like that, it's much, much less expensive to produce these products, which helps you both, have a better business model for how much value it'll capture, as well as it allows you to go after molecules that are maybe not quite as valuable. because your whole approach is requires much less, novel capital.
Yeah, it reminds me of a term that I've always wrestled with because it's sort of lobbed at the ag industry as an insult. And the term I'm talking about is factory farming. It's sort of lobbed at the industry as an insult. And I see where it's coming from. It's talking about like kind of mass produced, sort of biologically dead, sort of devoid of any sort of life or vibrancy type of process to produce food. But I also see the other side, which is just like, don't we want our food production system to be efficient? Wouldn't we want it to be as efficient as we want our car production system or our, you name your widget here production system, rather than being inefficient? And the way you're approaching things, it really does seem to me that we're sort of taking the positive side of factory farming. Like, let's look at this as a way to efficiently produce the molecules we want.
That's true. And the reality is most of the space in the grocery store that we all go out and fill our shopping carts with each week is food that comes in jars and boxes and bags, right? We all know we should eat more fruits and vegetables, and lots of us try and do that. But when I pack my kids' lunches, it's stuff that, came for that center part of the grocery store. And I want it to be as healthy as possible, to taste good, to set them up for success. And it's just a reality that there's a lot that we eat that comes from that part of the grocery store, and we can make it taste better and be healthier.
Yeah. Absolutely. Well, where's the company today? I know, I've done some other episodes on gene editing, and it does sound like that is getting some encouraging news in terms of regulatory approval and maybe more, I won't say fast track, but more efficient ways to get approved. Transgenics, I don't know if that's the case. Where's the company today, and is it kind of a regulatory hurdle going forward?
Yeah, that's a great question. That's a question that we get a lot. But the reality is, there have been commercial transgenic plants for over 30 years now. The path to get transgenic foods approved in the US is very clear. It's straightforward. We have people on our staff who've done this many times at other companies. And, you work with USDA, you work with the FDA, it's clear what they need. And it's just part of your plan of launching a company and launching a product, right? It takes a certain amount of time and a certain amount of money and attention, but it's pretty straightforward, and it's definitely not an obstacle for us. So where we are right now is we've created these top events. We're focused on sugar beet right now that are hitting commercial levels, that have the right composition, that seem like they're exactly what we need. And we're in field trials this year to really kind of, again, let the rubber hit the road and see how much we can produce. And, the goal, our challenge now is just producing enough sample that we can give to all of our potential partners and customers who are just desperate to see if this, monk fruit sweetener that we're making can solve their problems and give consumers what they want.
Right. I don't know if I already tried to make this point in this interview or if I just thought it in my head, but, one of the things that's interesting about this is historically the process has been, we can produce these commodities and then we get some really innovative kind of food engineering to turn them into what we want. You're almost shifting more of that value back to the farm with the genetics of saying like, okay, we know what people want. And so rather than just grow a commodity that, the price can be driven as low as possible for you, Mr. or Miss Farmer, let's have you actually have more of the value by producing that molecule yourselves. I don't know. Is that a real thing, or is that just a narrative in my head?
No, that's true. And, whenever you speak to farmers in the US, at least, they're always hungry for new innovation, new ways they can produce more with less, right? And the sugar beet world is no different. If you're, let's say, in the world of corn, there's lots of new innovations every year, but not every other crop gets that kind of attention. And so we've gotten, a lot of curiosity and a lot of interest from the farmers and processors and other people in the sugar beet world that we've talked to, who see this as one more layer of value they can stack on top of what they're already doing without them really having to change too much, just take advantage of, this new technology.
Yeah, and the commodity markets have been brutal lately. So I think what a great time to say like, hey, maybe you could grow something that's value added without changing a single part of your process. No new equipment. I mean, how to grow sugar beets. So just keep doing it. But here's some genetics that allow you to potentially get more value from your crop.
Yeah, and I think your last point's really important. And this is something I saw, in previous parts of my career is, a lot of times us technologists can, have this glib attitude of, oh, just buy this new, application, part for your tractor, right? And then no problem, you can just use it, right? And all this stuff costs money and time. And if you can fit within their existing way of working, it makes a really big difference.
Okay. how do you commercialize a product like this? It sounds like you already have buyers lined up from what you just said. You've talked to processors. Are you all going to be the seed company or the genetics company for the growers and then kind of handle the whole supply chain, at least initially? Or how do you kind of build this from the ground up?
Yeah, I think that's a really important question that, not all technology companies give enough thought to early on. So kind of, I think the default in this field, that's so dominated by the seed companies is to think, oh, well, we're going to license a trait, right? And then, there's kind of every step in the process where the more of it you develop, the more value you capture, but the more things you have to build before you're ever going to see any revenue, right? So you could, for example, just sell the seed, right? You could contract at the farm and then sell a raw ingredient, or you could take it all the way to a finished ingredient, or even just branding. We could have our own soda brand, right? And as we looked at this field and the way it was currently set up, what we saw is that there's kind of this really important inflection point where you have basically a raw ingredient, right? So a natural sweetener that might come in like a 50-pound bag, right? And then there's this whole ecosystem of flavor houses and ingredient companies that are really the experts that basically create drop-in solutions for the big food companies, right? So, the packaged consumer brands, they'll say like, well, I want a natural sweetener that works in yogurt, right? And these guys will have their own custom blend. And where we landed was that if we can be the supplier to those basically ingredient experts who have all these food scientists who know how to mix and match stuff, they know what Coke wants, they know what Pepsi wants, that was kind of our best point to capture as much value as possible without, starting down a path where it would be another 10 years before we would see any revenue. And so we're basically, we own the seed. We're going to contract with farmers. We're going to contract with processors. There's going to be value sharing for those partners. And then we're going to sell this completely unique, monk fruit natural sweetener that's, at the right price point, at the right availability, that we could then go to either these ingredient companies or in some cases the consumer packaged good companies and sell them, here's this pure monk fruit sweetener that you can use in your products.
Yeah. It's super cool. Well, let me make sure I was kind of tracking what you're saying. It sounded like what you're saying was kind of in this funding environment. It's no longer about like, okay, just think bigger, think bigger, think bigger. It's also like validate and get revenue, validate and get revenue. I mean, have you noticed that shift? And is that kind of what you're referring to?
Yeah, that's absolutely true. And it's so interesting in these conversations with potential funders. As soon as you say, we have something that we are ready to sell that we are selling, there's this unlock of all these funders who want to give you money. The challenge is getting to that point where you can prove that you have a product that consumers want and there's pull for. And until you get to that point in 2026, you need to be very focused on using the capital and time that you have to get to that proof point where you have, a product that you can prove has traction. And so that's why we're kind of all in right now on getting these field trials and these samples and the regulatory process where we can, stamp it and say, this is a product, there's proven demand. And then at that point, it's easy to get money to pour on top of it to just scale faster.
Well, as has seemed to be a theme in your career, you have kind of got exposure to something before it becomes more mainstream. Like your combination of biology with programming, statistical models, data science definitely has, probably been very helpful for you in your career. And I would think that's especially true right now with what we're seeing in artificial intelligence. And has advancements in the last 18 to 24 months in artificial intelligence changed the way your team is approaching your work?
For sure it is. Yeah. And that's something that I'm playing with these models on a daily basis and learning what they're good at, what they're not so good at. And, I keep having these moments where I say, hey, I had this activity that I did, a year ago or 3 years ago. What happens if I just try and have, Claude recreate this for me? And it's amazing the quality of complex financial models, complex analysis that these things can spit out in a few minutes that, the first time I did it, I spent weeks on. And so, I think in my world, it's most valuable in the upstream discovery, right? So as we think about new molecules, new ingredients we want to make, I think we can do it much faster and much less expensively than we did the first time around because of how fast you can kind of take stock of a landscape of knowledge, sift through it, find the interesting little kind of bits, which genes might help us, which ones won't. And then you still have to do all the testing, all the assays and building that you always do. But especially as you're jumping into new areas, I think it really is going to speed things up as we all kind of learn the best way to use it.
Very interesting. And what about, so it sounds like more on the upstream part, you said, less so on like the actual kind of gene discovery and kind of use of AI in things like gene editing, or are you seeing it there as well?
You can use it everywhere. Right? At any time that you either want to understand a new topic area, which includes, regulatory, it includes, consumer acceptance, anything that you're trying to quickly understand a new area, it's like having someone write a Wikipedia page for you, right? You still got to check all the details, but you can very quickly come up to speed. And, I think there's more and more workflows and, gene editing, identifying exactly the design for different editing spots it falls in the same bucket where, if you kind of have this crank that you turn all the time manually, you can now automate that in a way that you couldn't before. And I think these models are incredibly capable and we're still just barely figuring out how to use them. I think it's going to change a lot.
Yeah. Okay. Well, it's actually comforting for me to hear that you also think that we're just kind of barely figuring out how to use them, because that's how I feel too. But the general sense I get from a lot of people is they feel behind. Like, right? It's like, I feel like everyone else knows how to use AI, just like plug and play. And I'm still like fumbling around in the dark of like, this is cool, but how exactly am I going to really, leverage it the best way possible? So to hear people like you say, yeah, we're still figuring it out, I think is actually comforting.
Yeah, and you just got to play with it. Every question you run into in your personal life, you have a tax question, ask the AI first, see what it says. And it's amazing what they'll turn out to be capable of.
Yeah. So far, it's been most helpful to me in helping me coach Little League. That has been, that's been the biggest thing.
For sure. Yeah.
Well, cool. So the show is called Future of Agriculture, Matt. As we think through molecular farming and everything that you're doing at Elo Life there, and we try to kind of, extrapolate that forward, help cast the vision for us. How does agriculture look different in 5 or 10 years as a result of the success of Elo Life?
Yeah, so if I take a step back and think about what I really think molecular farming can do, we've had these shifts in technology over time. So, 100 years ago, synthetic chemistry really came into its own. And we realized that you could turn oil, which we had huge amounts of, into all these amazing substances, right? You go to the hospital, there's so much plastic around you that's keeping people alive and saving lives. Everything you look around you is basically made from oil. And it's been incredible technology. And it also has some sustainability and some, economic and environmental sustainability issues that we all know about, right? The next big technology was fermentation. It's been, I think, 50 years that we've had transgenic microbes making all these amazing enzymes and proteins. The fact that we have biotechnology enzymes in all of our laundry detergent is pretty amazing, and they've been there a long time. And every time a new technology comes online, we realize there's more that we can do. We can make better products, and we can also solve problems that earlier technologies caused. And the thing that I love about molecular farming is, if you're in synthetic chemistry with petrochemicals or fermentation, you have to build this factory site, right? And it could be $50 million, it could be $200 million. You have to pay for all this concrete and steel and electricity. And when you're working with plants, in agriculture, we're very aware of the cost of diesel and nitrogen, but your top 3 inputs are sunshine, rain, and carbon dioxide. And 2 or 3 of those are free in pretty much anywhere you go in agriculture. So I think there's amazing opportunity to produce all these same chemicals that are so valuable that we use other processes for in a way that is kind of, the most affordable, the most sustainable. And my favorite points about it is, if you want to double your production capacity in your synthetic chemistry, you have to build another site. You just plant more seeds. And so, it's a little bit glib to say that, but there's a lot of truth that this is a technology that could produce the chemicals that we want at a scale and affordability that should be able to beat anything we've done before. The key thing is for us to kind of walk up that technology ladder of being able to make more and more things as fast and inexpensively as possible so that we can address, what are often commodity chemicals that are very cheap to make from oil.
Oh, yeah. If you could make the economics work with a bioplastic, that seems like it would be the holy grail.
Yeah, and especially going back to the co-product idea, right? Every time, you have a processing mill that splits corn or soybean into its inherent molecules, right? Starch and oil and protein. You bring one more molecule off, 2 more molecules off, and you're just getting more from that same acreage without, a proportional increase in cost or inputs or impacts on the environment.
Yeah. Well, I would love to sit and pick your scientific brain for a couple more hours, but as we kind of wind down for this session, at least, I wonder if there's any message that if you could speak to a room full of farmers or people in agriculture, as sort of a keynote speaker talking about the science, what would you want to impart as your message to folks in agriculture about what's happening kind of on the scientific forefront of our industry?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think when we come down to it, agriculture is one of the most effective technologies we've ever had, right? I mean, everything that we see and we live on is from agriculture. And it's something that we've optimized over thousands of years and intensively with technology for the past 100. And I think there's a lot of very interesting new technologies coming. I think the challenge for people like myself is always to sort through all these kind of pie in the sky, blue sky ideas and really pick those ones that can drive value and can do it in a reasonable timeline. And, I can imagine farmers can probably get tired of people coming and pitching them new technology all the time. But if you take the approach that, 1 in 100 of these ideas is going to make a huge difference and just be patient and be discriminating, I think there's some very exciting things to come over the next generation. And we'll all have to kind of learn together where those opportunities are.
Yeah. Matt, this has been awesome. I want to just give you a chance. Anything you want to either add or emphasize before I let you go? I really enjoyed the conversation.
Yeah, I really appreciate it. It's been fun for me, Tim. I'm used to listening to your podcast every time it comes out. So it's fun to chat with you like this. I think it's just really exciting the potential we have to do good with technology. And I would just encourage anyone out there who's curious about it to just learn more, to not be afraid to jump in and try and make things work. And I think, no matter how much we learn, there's always going to be so much more that we don't know than we do know. And I think we just need to jump in and try things and see what works and stay focused on the value we're creating for our, consumer at the end of what we do.
Mm-hmm. And what keeps you so enthusiastic to keep doing this work? Like, what is it that you're just like, no, this is where I need to be right now?
It's just fun to work in a field where where the world's always turned upside down, where there's every couple of years there's a new technology that fundamentally changes everything. And it's cool to kind of be at, kind of my stage in my career where, it's easy as you kind of get through mid and later career to kind of get jaded and be like, oh, these kinds of ideas will never work. But when these new technologies come up, you can go back to your assumptions and be like, yes, we always assumed this idea wouldn't work. But now with this technology, that changes this. So old ideas become new again. And it's just really fun to be in a dynamic space where you just keep getting these unlocks. It just kind of changed the landscape.
So cool. Matt, thanks again. Really, really appreciate you being on the show.
Thank you, Tim. This has been a lot of fun.
All right, well, that's going to do it for today's episode. I sure hope you enjoyed that as much as I did. Fascinating stuff. I mean, it just kind of renews your excitement for innovation in science and the impact it can have on the future of agriculture and ultimately healthier, happier human beings, because that's what we're all going for, right? Well, thank you once again to Matt DiLeo. Really appreciate him being on the show. I encourage each of you to go learn more about what they're doing on their website, which is just Elo Life, elolife.com. Thanks so much for your time and your attention. I do not take it lightly. I'll be back next week with another story of ag innovation.